Let's go now to Marilyn, who has a question about federal lands. Marilyn, you're on the line with Senator Lee.
Yes, thanks for taking my call. We're ranchers in southwest Utah, and I've been keeping track of what Ken Ivory is doing with taking the federal land and trying to get it back to the states. We, as ranchers, work with the state and the federal, and they're very hostile to us, the BLM, and real hard to work with. The state is amazing. We love working with the state. We're also having to work through this Mustang issue, which we're really having a hard time with. They're just devastating the lands. We haven't had a gather for over 10 years, and they're just getting more and more and more. And I just wondered what your thoughts on those two issues are.
Marilyn, there's a Scottish rock band called the Proclaimers, and they have a song that was popular years ago. And the chorus of it says something like, I can't understand why we let someone else rule our land. And in Utah, we are sympathetic to that sentiment because 2/3 of our land, nearly 70% of it, is owned by the federal government. Now, most states don't have that problem, at least not nearly to the extent that we do. You've got states like Texas, where the federal government owns, I think, less than 1% of the land. You've got states like North Dakota that have enjoyed a huge boom to their economic activity in the state because they've been able to access immense energy reserves that are on their land. They wouldn't be able to access that energy, at least not nearly to the same degree, if their state were full of federal land like ours is. It's difficult, it's disappointing, and it can be excruciating for us to have to go to the federal government in order to access federal land. I know it causes problems for ranchers, it causes problems for people who want to access federal land for almost any reason. One of the biggest problems with it, and one of the reasons why I'm happy that Ken Ivory is taking such a hard look at this, has to do with the fact that we experience a really significant loss of tax revenue as a result of federal land ownership in our state. Because the federal government owns nearly 70% of the land, that means that about 70% of the land is beyond our ability to tax because the federal government has declared itself exempt from property taxes. This is a problem. There's no other entity on planet Earth, certainly no other entity in America, that would ever dream of owning that much land without paying for it, without the ability or the intention of paying property taxes. Now, the federal government has simply declared itself exempt from taxation. It's recognized the fact that this puts an enormous burden on our ability within the state of Utah to fund important priorities like public education, fire and rescue services, other emergency services, our sheriff's departments and police offices. This is a big problem for us. Recognizing this, Congress has created a program called PILT, Payment in Lieu of Taxes. And under that program, the idea is to sort of offset the economic burden that the federal government puts on states with a lot of federal public land. But it often results in the federal government paying only pennies on the dollar compared to what it would pay in property taxes if it were paying property taxes. It's one of the reasons I've been working with my colleagues to make them aware of this issue and to move toward a system where the federal government ought to be required to pay property taxes or the functional equivalent thereof. If it did that, then the federal government would be more fair to those states where it owns a lot of land. And it might have to reconsider whether or not it ought to own that much land. The federal government owns about 600 million acres of land in the United States. It owns roughly 30% of the land mass in the entire United States. This is too much. There's no reason why it needs to own this much land. Certainly no reason why it needs to own nearly 70% of the land in our state. Now, I'm not suggesting that it ought to sell off national parks or forest land, or that it ought to sell off declared wilderness. What I am saying is that the garden variety BLM land that's neither national park, national recreation area, or national monument or anything like that, that land perhaps ought to be examined as something that could be sold or perhaps handed over to the state for management. Not all of that land should be managed from Washington, D.C. by people who are not from Utah and don't understand or share our values or our economic interests. That's why I'm working every day as a member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee to educate my colleagues on these issues and to push for meaningful reforms that will help push the federal government in the right direction and bring local control back to the state of Utah.